The Labour Party has introduced a number of major climate reforms over its last term in office, which the coalition has promised to unwind. Climate is an issue both the Greens and Teal independents have been campaigning hard on, as an area that differentiates them from the major parties. So Labour has a target of 43% emissions reduction by 2030, and its biggest focus is rolling out renewable energy to get to a goal of 82% by the end of the decade. It's also promised a subsidy of 30% on batteries for homes and businesses with solar. And Labour intends to host the International UN Climate Conference in Adelaide next year if re-elected. The coalition's main focus is on its nuclear policy, which would not be up and running until the late 2030s at the earliest. It hasn't committed to a target for lowering Australia's emissions by 2030. It's also promised to scrap a tax break for people switching to electric cars and standards to encourage more efficient cars and EVs to be sold. The coalition would also open up a renewables funding program for gas. The Greens and Independents both want Australia to take stronger action on climate change, with higher emissions targets for 2030 and 2035. The Greens also want Australia to stop approving new coal and gas projects and commit to a plan to phase out fossil fuels. They've also outlined policies to help households get off gas and electrify, with a big focus on renters who are often locked out of these benefits. But to find out more about where the parties stand, I'm joined by ABC climate reporter Jo Lauder. Hi there, Jo. So climate hasn't been as big a focus as during the last election. Labour is running to continue its progress on renewables and other support for clean technology. So what's the last 3 years been like from a climate policy perspective?
If we look back at the last 3 years, there has been a number of quite significant reforms, and Labor is really running largely on a platform of continuing this. Some of these policies, I guess you could call them kind of wonky or a bit unsexy. Some of it's a bit more behind the scenes and they don't get as much attention as some of the other policies that you might be aware of. But the big one, as you mentioned, the 2030 emissions reduction target of 43%. So Labor legislated this in the last term of government, and so this is what Australia's policy in terms of, like, I guess that's the overarching structure for Australia for its climate policy. But a really big part of that as well is the renewables target of getting to 82% renewables by 2030. And the reason that they're really interconnected, even though they are different, is because it's generally accepted that you decarbonise your electricity sector first, because in Australia, electricity is the dirtiest industry or the dirtiest sector that we have. So it has the highest emissions. So you bring that down first, but also because we have solutions in terms of renewables already in that sector. And the other reason is if you do electricity first, then you've also got, once you have a cleaner grid, that also helps decarbonise your transport emissions and heavy industry. So that's why there's a really big focus in this decade on emissions and especially emissions from electricity. Some of the other reforms that have happened in the last few years is the safeguard mechanism was strengthened. This was actually introduced under Tony Abbott, but it was really strengthened in the last term of government. And so it regulates the biggest emitters, the biggest facilities. So it's just over 200 facilities that are the biggest polluters in Australia. And so those changes were brought in during the last term. They were supported, a lot of these were supported by the Greens and the Independents, but at the same time, they wanted to see them to have stronger emissions regulations. So that was another one. Then we've seen, again, focusing on renewables, there's the capacity investment scheme. And so this really gives some financial support and certainty for renewables investors about what the government would like to see being invested into the Australian grid. So that was a really big one. And then we also had transport changes as well. There's the fuel efficiency standards. So this encourages car makers, or it basically, what happens is that they have to have an emissions cap on their overall fleet that they're selling into Australia. So it means they can sell higher polluting cars or higher emitting cars, but they have to balance that with lower emitting ones as well. And there was some EV tax breaks as well. And so this is what's been happening in the last 3 years. At the same time, there's been a lot of criticism from energy and climate experts around Labor's continued approval of coal and gas. But that really sets the scene for what we've seen in the last 3 years and what Labor has been running in terms of its campaign on for this election.
Okay, so Labor is really about staying the course. What about the coalition? What's it promising?
The big focus in the climate space for the coalition, or it's almost climate adjacent, is the energy sector, which is, as you said, their nuclear policy. So this is rolling out a fleet of nuclear-powered energy electricity plants across the country. The big challenge with this is that if it comes online, it's decades away potentially. The late 2030s, we would see any nuclear reactors being built in Australia. And so when that happens, that would decarbonise the electricity sector. But there is this period in between of what would happen. As I said, electricity is Australia's dirtiest sector. And so we would have, the way that the coalition is looking at it, there would be more reliance on coal and gas in between, which would increase Australia's emissions. The other big focus really for the coalition is unwinding some of those policies that I was talking about. They've said during the campaign that they are going to cut these popular EV tax breaks that were introduced during the last term. Also taking away the penalties from the fuel efficiency standards, so there wouldn't be any penalties for car makers to go over the limit, which would kind of really weaken those policies because there wouldn't be those penalties. They also want to open up the capacity investment scheme, that renewables fund, to include gas projects. And they also have a policy that came in under Labor. This was, it's mandatory disclosure, so it means that companies have to report their emissions each year. And so earlier in the year, the coalition did say that they would look at scrapping that as well. And so energy experts and climate experts that I've spoken to have got, the other thing as well, I should say, the coalition hasn't announced a 2030 emissions target. They said they would only do that if they're elected and not in opposition. So climate experts are really questioning and concerned about what would happen for emissions in Australia if the coalition were to win in that medium-term period.
And climate action, Joe, is a major policy focus for a number of the Teal independents, also for the Greens. So what are they focused on and what could that mean for the next term of government?
Yeah, this is a really big focus for the Teals and the Greens. I think we just heard earlier Adam Bandt talking about one of the things, if we have a minority government, that they would negotiate on is no new fossil fuel projects. And that was something that they spoke about quite a lot during the last term of government as well. So if we do get a minority government on May 3, and there is these negotiations with the Teals and the Greens, climate is going to be a really big focus. Some of the other policies that they've been talking about is really focusing on household efficiency. This is like becoming quite popular across Australia, and it's really encouraging homes to take up solar, to take up batteries, and to remove gas appliances and electrify their homes. So a number of the Teals have got policies around, it's almost like a HEX scheme for loans for houses, so people can introduce or like implement some of these electrification changes. The Greens and the Independents also have been pushing for stronger emissions reductions targets, both for 2030, and whichever party forms government at the end of this week or early next week, they're also going to have to set a 2035 climate target that's going to be required under the Paris Agreement. And just on that, as well, as you mentioned, Labor, if it wins, it wants to host the COP31, these climate conference. These are the major UN climate conferences where tens of thousands of people would come to Australia, and they want to host it next year if they win in Adelaide alongside Pacific countries. If that happens, there's always a lot of scrutiny on host countries and what they're doing in terms of their climate action. So again, there would be a lot of focus on Australia's fossil fuel industry and especially, coal and gas industry. So I think that'll be a big focus as well in the next term of government.